Hello everyone and welcome to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by Motors, the driving force behind multi-site advertising, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters across the franchised and independent dealer sectors.
Hello and welcome to Motor Trade Radio. Today we're delighted to welcome back friend of the pod, Steve Young, Managing Director of ICDP, the International Automotive Retailing Consultancy. Steve is joining us to discuss ICDP's newly published European Top 50 Dealer Groups. Now, every year, the Top 50 provides an analysis of the financial standing of some of the biggest franchise groups by turnover, and has been doing so for 10 years now, which means ICDP is in a unique position to track the ebbs and flows of individual groups and the ongoing impact of consolidation on the sector as a whole, which is certainly a major theme of the latest Top 50. So plenty to talk about, and welcome back to the pod, Steve.
Thanks, Curtis, and thanks, Philip. Thank you both for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
So there's obviously lots that we could talk about, but we're trying to focus on the top 50 on this one, because I think there's probably too much to talk about in the minute, Steve, with what's going on in the world of automotive. But as Curtis has said that, I mean, you've been doing this now for 10 years, but for the benefit of the listeners, do you want to give a bit of background on those who are eligible for inclusion in the top 50 and the period that it's covered within it, and some of those key numbers?
Sure. I mean, it's Greater Europe, so not just the EU, but also looking a bit further afield, includes Switzerland, includes Norway, and it's the independent dealer groups, which includes some importer dealer groups, but it doesn't include pure importers. So, for example, from a UK perspective, International Motors wouldn't feature because they don't have retail. And we would exclude the manufacturer-owned chains, so Stellantis and you or Renault Retail Group, for example, Mercedes Retail in those markets where that still exists. Although we're publishing almost at the end of 24, it's based on 23 revenues, or it might be April 23 to March 24 financial years, because that's the that's the lead, the time that's required from the end of the year until people are filing accounts and so on. So again, from a European wide perspective. So it's based on 23 independents, ranked by turnover. Sometimes, because they're private groups, in many cases, we need to make some estimates, but we try and check those out where we can. We've looked for any impact of agency on revenue, and whilst it might be buried in there somewhere, it's not significant enough that we feel that anyone is out of position because of it. But that's the potted history, and that's how it's been for, as you say, for 10 years now.
Now, Steve, can you take us through the top 10, where the top two are unchanged year on year, but there's been plenty of jostling for positions in the rest of the top 10?
Sure. I mean, Emil Frey, the Swiss group, not present in the UK, but quite a wide footprint elsewhere in Western Europe and Central Europe, are still number one. They've been number one since, I think, about 2017-18, when they acquired PGA from Porsche Holdings. So that was a big transaction, 200, 300 dealerships at the time, as I recall.
Yeah.
They replaced Pendragon, who had up until that time been number one, and really, when you look back, is perhaps the pioneering large dealer group. And just to show how times have changed, then they actually are no longer in the top 10 as of last year as an independent business. Penske, who we know here as Sytner, are sitting at number 2. They're also present in Germany, Italy, and Spain, but the bulk of their revenue, putting them into second position, is Sytner. I think if you looked at Sytner in isolation, it would probably still be number 2. But we consider them as a US group because that's the parentage of Sytner.
Yeah.
Then we have Hedden, which 10 years ago was not really in the list at all, and it's sitting there now in a strong third position. So at this point, we've gone down from 17 billion euros to 7. That's how spread out that top 3 are, and they've grown, over 40%, 23 versus 22. So massive growth. Then below them, we're now into sort of 5 to 6 billion euros turnover, covering the next 7 groups, and within that, perhaps the most interesting one is Van Mossel, which is a new name to us in the UK currently. They acquired Jackson's earlier in the year. I think they'll make more acquisitions in the UK, but they've jumped up 7 places from last year to this because of the pace of acquisitions they're making elsewhere in Europe. So it's a huge leasing business and dealer group. Then we get some familiar names: Arnold Clark, Inchcape, Virtue, all clustered there at 5, 6, 7. AMAG is the Swiss Volkswagen Group importer. 8. D'Ieteren is the Belgian Volkswagen Group importer at 9. So a lot of their revenue is actually through the importing activity rather than the retail. And then number 10 is Lookers, which we now count as Canadian after the takeover by Alpha Auto, Global Auto Holdings. And they slipped back 6 places. The revenue is still up by 5%, but when everyone else is growing by 10s, 20s, 30s, 40% in a couple of cases, then +5 doesn't cut it. So they fell back, and I think that's largely the reflection of all the disruption from the acquisition last year.
So as you say, quite a few changes there in the top 10. If we were to open it up, any observations about what was going on in the top 20 and the top 50 as a whole, especially for some of the UK-owned groups?
Well, if you look back over the 10 years, because year to year you can have distractions and the impact of a single acquisition or a single sale, for example. But if we look at the top 20, then it has changed quite significantly from the point of view of the UK group. So 2013, almost half the top 20 were UK. So it's names like Pendragon, Virtue, Jardine, and so on. And that's now down to a quarter. Now, some of those groups have not gone away. Lookers is still here, but we consider it Canadian. Jardine, Pendragon, we are still here, but now both owned by Lithia. So in the 24 edition of those top 50, then those two will be combined under Lithia, but showing as an American group. We've had a couple of additional Nordic groups, so notably Hedden. We've had a French group come into the top 20 for the first time. It's the dealer group called Buy My Car, who've expanded into, I think, 3 other markets now, so far clustered around France, so Spain and Belgium, Italy. But who knows? They have been expanding very quickly, moved up the ranking. The 4 of the original top 20 have been acquired either in whole or, in the case of Inchcape Europe, they sold off the UK retail business, as we saw earlier this year. 5 went out from the top 20, but are still there. 1, the Belgian group Alcopa, which most people probably wouldn't recognise, but it was a significant group several years ago. It completely got out of automotive retail. So just because someone's sitting in the top 20, we shouldn't assume they're there forever, because these things happen, and you could imagine that happening with some others. 6 new companies came in, 2 of them went straight into the top 5, which is Hedden and Van Mossel. So quite a lot of turmoil, but much less UK dominated. The French actually overtook the UK. So we have in the top 50, we have 20% of them are French now, 18% are UK, 16% are German. But the structure of those groups is actually quite different nationally. You're not comparing like with like when you say UK groups versus German groups, or German groups versus French groups.
And I mean, a lot of changes. Is it that kind of, when you've seen these changes before, Steve, over that 10 years, are you sort of seeing this a lot more changes than before? I mean, just a very quick question there, but there's a lot of shifts, isn't there, with these acquisitions and things like that?
It has changed, I think. I mean, I think the process was already underway. I mean, the process in the UK of the big groups, started way back. I don't know, 30 years ago or whatever it is, since Pendragon emerged as a major group. But then we had a whole load of others around at that time as well. They were also sort of large, certainly covering a large part of the country, if not quite national. The Dutch were pretty quick onto the consolidation scene, so that was already happening in the Netherlands in 2013. But the other markets tended to lag behind, and not just in terms of consolidation and scale, but also how they work, because Pendragon really sort of pioneered the sort of central management model. So it wasn't just a big group with a holding company and lots of dealerships. They actually had quite a lot of activity at the centre, and that's been replicated in other UK groups, partly because all those acquisitions meant there were lots of senior executives who didn't want to stay. Their business was bought, and they ended up going somewhere else. But they did take some of that approach and learning with them. Yeah. But when you look at the continental groups, then they've started to transfer from that holding company model into one which has got much more central coordination, shared services at the centre, and so on. So that's quite normal in France. Less so in Germany, common in the Nordics, common in Italy, or becoming more common in Italy. Common in the Benelux. So, as usual with the UK, then sometimes, we export good ideas, even if we don't end up owning them in the end.
Right, yeah. And I mean, turning back to the results, and obviously with everything going on, the shift towards electrification, EVs, and obviously the new brands, the new entrants especially from China and obviously other international markets. How is that attributed to this year's or the last these set of results?
I think that there's plenty of owner operators out there who remain nervous about what the future holds, and it's not only about electrification. It's about the growing role of the OEMs in retail, whether it's agency or whether it's just a modified franchise, and greater degrees of control. Scale of investment perhaps is slipped down the priority list a little bit, but certainly that was an issue when people were expected to make big investments of 10, 15 million euros or pounds in a gin palace. And so if you're a family owner and you're looking at that, and maybe your children aren't so excited they'd rather get into making TikTok videos and selling cars, then that can be a trigger for a sale. And so it's more on the push side than the pull side. People have been pushed into selling rather than people saying, oh, electrification and so on is a great opportunity for me. I need to buy more dealerships. It's more that there's more for sale, more deals to be done on on the buy side.
Fantastic. Well, we'll be back right after this break with a little bit more on the top 50 dealer group report.
You're listening to all the chatter that matters on a special weekday episode of Motor Trade Radio, powered by Motors, the driving force behind multi-site advertising.
Now, Steve, turning to ownership, and you have actually mentioned about this influx of French-owned groups. How has ownership changed this year in terms of the countries where groups are headquartered? And as a sort of follow-up to that, why is it that Switzerland seems to punch above its weight? It's got some big hitters in there, with ML Frey and a couple of other groups.
I think dealing with the Swiss one first, the three big groups in Switzerland, so Frey, Merbag, and AMAG, all have significant distribution activity. So that immediately obviously boosts the revenue. And they also have, significant retail operations, but it helps. I think, about 40% of the top 20 are also distributors for at least one brand in one market. And that seems to be a growing trend. Someone like Hedden, for example, was not in distribution 3 years ago, I don't think. But then, you asked about Chinese brands. Then they picked up distribution for a couple of Chinese brands. They picked up distribution for Ford in Sweden. So there's some new thinking coming along on the part of the manufacturers about whether they really need to be acting as the distributor, through a national sales company in every market, particularly the smaller ones. So that puts some of the dealers, if you like, you could say out of position a little bit. But that's not to knock someone like ML Frey, which is, a huge retail business as well. But in terms of the changes, I think there's been a balancing out, if you like. The UK's been attractive as a place to invest for the North Americans, but the UK specifically, not Europe as a whole. And you could still imagine that AutoNation will come in and take out somebody. So we could have another North American player and one less in the UK. The French have grown, very aggressively, and a lot of respect to them. They've become much more national, less regionally focused. So they're not just in one part of France. They've got broader coverage, and they're reaching outside of France, to a large extent. Germany's maybe the laggard. Nordic has grown, primarily because of Hedden, but that's not to knock the efforts of others like Belia, for example, which is also a strong player, but relative to Hedden looks small. Benelux, a lot of concentration, a lot of consolidation there. Some very capable groups there, and with a operating model that most British dealers would recognise, doing much the same things. And then, other markets like Italy or Spain or Portugal are sort of sitting there with one dealer each. Li Xinghong, you'll recognise as the owner of some of the Mercedes outlets, particularly the big one in Stockport is the flagship. And we've got some other, overseas investors sort of further down from the Middle East, for example, South Africa, and they will probably increase their footprint. They've already got the presence here. They've already got their toes in the water, and they've probably got the capital to continue to invest and take advantage of some of the opportunities.
And Steve, looking at used car sales, because I think you particularly highlighted the strong performance for used cars from Anne Clark in the report. What were the general trends of the used cars as well across the rest of the top 50, and what made you sort of highlight that strong performance from Arnold Clark's?
Well, the best way to describe the used car performance with the top 50 is random. the the used to new ratio, which is what we track because it's relatively easily accessible, or we can estimate it from the numbers that are available, has gone up and down over the period, and it actually sits now at a lower level than it did in 2013. So it's 0.91 to 1 as across the whole of the top 50 last year. And the argument, when I speak to continental European dealer groups and say, well, why aren't you doing more? Because lots of them are down at 0.5 or 0.6 to 1, is to do with the structure of the market. They say, well, we don't have leasing, so we don't have cars coming out at 3 years old. If they're in places like Spain, then they say, well, we get all the ex rental cars from the holiday resorts, and we're expected to take them by the manufacturers. That absorbs all the capital, it fills all the spaces. We can't then go out and buy, used cars in the open market. So they come up with market factors as the reason for underperformance. But in all the markets, you'll also find people who do much better, and the standout across the top 50 is Arnold Clark, which has been set up as a sort of an ecosystem that feeds the used car machine, with the daily rental, with the leasing business, with lots of, clever digital stuff to encourage people to sell their car to Arnold Clark, not to, We Buy Any Car or whatever. And their performance 10 years ago was strong, but still sort of in touch with the rest at 1.5, and the rest were sort of 0.96. But, they've gone up to over 4, used to new, in the year after the pandemic, when new car supply was restricted. Now that the new car supply is back, but the used car supply is restricted, it's gone down, but it's still 3.5. So it's 3 times, or almost 3 times, the performance of the average of the top 50. But it's because that's what they set out to do, and the whole business is really geared up as a used car business that happens to sell new cars.
And Steve, inevitably, when you compile the listings, as you explained, you have a cut-off date for the year ends. And of course, there's been plenty of M&A activity since then, since the cut-off. What are the key M&A trends you've tracked up to the end of October? And how do you think that will impact, say, next year's top 50?
Well, we tried to track all the deals. I'm sure we missed some, particularly some of the smaller ones and some of them in smaller markets, but we tracked over 160 deals to the end of October. 15 of those were cross-border, so the buyer was headquartered in a different location to the target. A quarter of the deals were made by half the members of the top 50. So 24 out of the top 50 did deals, and they did a quarter of that total. So I don't know what 24 dealers is out of the whole of the European population, but it's a sub 1% of the dealer groups, if you like, made a quarter of all the deals. And they acquired also a disproportionate number of the franchise points. So there's 800 franchise points. Almost half of those were in the deals that were made by the top 50. So the top 50 players are buying, medium-sized groups. The average is 9 franchise points per deal. The smaller groups tend to be buying up a neighboring site, which might have 1 or 2 or 3 dealerships or franchise points. So they're continuing to outpace. The top 50 are outpacing, the rest.
Yeah.
And notably this year we've seen the deals here for Pendragon to buy Lithia, which will probably, as a rough estimate, will move them up to around number 4. Group 1 has bought Inchcape Retail. That'll move Group 1 up into the top 10. Van Mossel has made an acquisition in Germany. I think there's probably some more to come this year, but they will, probably hold their position, something similar to Lithia, because the gap then to number 3 to Hedon is so big at this stage. So, some more big moves to come as a result of those deals, but lots of activity further down within the top 50, and they're just continuing to get bigger.
I mean, like you say, you've just indicated the potential that there's still a lot more to come across UK, Europe, and particularly, like you say, with some of those operations out in the Netherlands and the US, as you mentioned earlier. It's always fascinating, and we can talk about this for a long time because there's a lot of activity taking place. But I think for the listeners, if they do want a copy of to get a copy of the report, then they can contact ICDP, and it's either icdp.net, or if you drop an email to Jane at projectoffice@icdp.net. With what information that you'd like to try and obtain from ICDP and the work that Steve and the wider team does. But Steve, you're working on a couple of webinars which will be potentially of interest to the listeners, particularly that they are open to broader outside of the membership itself. Do you want to just share with what they are and how they can potentially get registered for these webinars that are coming up?
Sure. The other main dealer, we do a top 300, but the other main dealer publication that we do is called a European Car Distribution Handbook. So that's not names, but it's numbers, and it's all the brands. It looks like it'll be over 50 brands this year, with some of the newcomers included. In 35 markets. So if you're looking at how does one brand representation compare to another, how does it perform in terms of new car sales per franchise point and so on, then that handbook is the one to look at, and that will be published in the next 1 or 2 weeks, but the webinar is on December 10th. And then for those who are more interested in what we do as a whole and the research program, and they might be interested in joining the research program, then that's December the 11th. So the details of both of those are on the website, and unusually, compared to our normal meetings, and those two are both open to non-members. So anyone that's interested can dip in, and they'll find some stuff there of interest, I hope.
Yeah, and anybody that hasn't sort of thought this, I can very much say that it's worth joining them if you can, and then getting involved with ICDP. A huge thank you as always, and again, every time we have this conversation, for any listener that isn't subscribed to Steve's weekly blog on icdp.net, or you'll see it through Steve's LinkedIn post, I highly recommend subscribing to it. Very insightful, very entertaining sometimes as well, if you don't mind me saying that. So, Steve, with a bit of an edge on some of the things that you do talk about, but always great read, and definitely worth subscribing to Steve's weekly blog.
Yeah, I try not to be boring.
You're certainly not. No.
We particularly like some of the headlines you run with, Steve. They're always eye-catching.
You must be getting harder and harder to come up with now.
Well, there's so much raw material gets fed to us going on in the industry that sometimes the headline usually comes first. I come up with the headline.
It's the industry that keeps on giving.
Completely unconvinced. I need to talk about something that fits this headline. So.
It's one of them. It keeps on giving, Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll make a journalist out of you yet, Steve.
I try. I actually managed to get Wangler press pass for Paris. So I was a fully accredited journalist for the Paris Motor Show.
Well, Look, Steve, many thanks for joining us. Really enjoyed this conversation, and we will catch up with you again soon. Unfortunately, that's all for now. So thank you for listening to this Motor Trade Radio weekday special. Philip and I are back with all the big car retailing headlines this weekend. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
Thank you for listening to this special weekday Motor Trade Radio podcast. Powered by Motors, the driving force behind multi-site advertising. Philip and Curtis will be back with the week's big motor retailing headlines on Saturday. Live, on demand, wherever you are, on your podcast feed.